So, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight to the seaport on this beautiful, amazing day. It's been so sunny out, and now we're gonna get this lovely little event. My name is Ryan. I'm one of the event hosts here at McNally Jackson. A few quick things before we begin. If you haven't picked up your voucher or your book yet, you can do so after the event, or we'll be having a sort of signing and personalization. So more about that later. But the voucher is good for anything. So you can get $5 off at the bookstore, at the cafe. You can get some drinks. You can get Samantha some drinks. You can get some more if you want. Just be sure to use it today. And there is going to be a Q&A at the end, so start thinking of your questions now, because I always raise my hand and then forget. So, and if you have some questions for us, we're going to be at the upstairs info desk right over there. And I think that's about it. This is like a lovely packed crowd, so I'm excited to start. First off, introducing first is Samantha Harvey. Give a round of applause for Samantha. It's amazing. Samantha Harvey is the author of 5 novels: Orbital, The Western Wind, Deer Thief, All Is Song in the Wilderness, which won the Betty Trask Prize, and one work of nonfiction, The Shapeless Unease. Her books have been shortlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction, the Guardian First Book Award, and the James Tate Black Prize, as well as longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, Bailey's Women's Prize, and she lives in Bath, UK, and teaches creative writing at the Bath Spa University. But it's not in here, so I'm going to get a little chastised. You also won the 2024 Booker Prize, so you should update your bio a little bit. Congratulations. That's amazing. Sorry. And in conversation is the equally iconic Molly Young, who writes about books for the New York Times and is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. Her journalism and essays have appeared in N+1, the Poetry Foundation, and others. I've been a big fan for the Poetry Foundation stuff. So her zine, Things I Fancied, was named one of NPR's best books of 2020. With Teddy Blanks, she runs a small press and most recently published the novel Miriam by Kate Riley, which was excerpted in the Paris Review. So give it up for Molly Young. And I think I'm going to hand it off to Samantha if you want to do a little reading before we start the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, is this working? Yes. Great. Thank you all so much for being here. We've been told to hold our mics like this, which feels quite awkward. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. I'm going to do a short reading from near the beginning of the book, which I don't think needs any introduction. Is it quiet?
I think you need to speak a little
Just
bit.
a little louder.
Yeah? Okay, I'll do my best. Okay. They look down and they understand why it's called Mother Earth. They all feel it from time to time. They all make an association between Earth and a mother, and this in turn makes them feel like children. In their clean-shaven, androgynous bobbing, their regulation shorts and spoonable food, the juice drunk through straws, the birthday bunting, the early nights, the enforced innocence of dutiful days. They all have moments up here of a sudden obliteration of their astronaut selves and a powerful sense of childhood and smallness, their towering parent ever present through the dome of glass. But now, more so. Since Chie came into the galley on Friday evening where they were making dinner, her face colourless with shock, and said, "My mother has died." And Sean let go of his packet of noodles so that it floated above the table, and Pietro swam 3 feet towards her, bowed his head, and took both of her hands with a choreography so seamless you'd have thought it was prepared. And Nell muttered something indecipherable, a question. What? How? When? What? And watched Chie's pale face flush crimson suddenly, as if the speaking of those words had given heat to her grief. Since that news, they find themselves looking down at Earth as they circle their way around it, meanderingly it seems, though that couldn't be less true. And there's that word, mother, 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 mother. Chie's only mother now is that rolling, glowing ball that throws itself involuntarily around the sun once a year. Chie has been made an orphan, her father dead a decade. That ball is the only thing she can point to now that has given her life. There's no life without it. Without that planet, there's no life. Obvious. Think a new thought, they sometimes tell themselves. The thoughts you have in orbit are so grandiose and old. Think a new one, a completely fresh, unthought one. But there are no new thoughts. They're just old thoughts born into new moments. And in these moments is the thought, without that earth, we are all finished. We couldn't survive a second without its grace. We are sailors on a ship on a deep, dark, unswimmable sea. None of them knows what to say to Chie. What consolation you can offer to someone who suffers the shock of bereavement while in orbit. You must want surely to get home and say some sort of goodbye. No need to speak. You only have to look out through the window at a radiance doubling and redoubling. The earth from here is like heaven. It flows with colour, a burst of hopeful colour. When we're on that planet, we look up and think heaven is elsewhere, but here is what the astronauts and cosmonauts sometimes think. Maybe all of us born to it have already died and are in an afterlife. If we must go to an improbable, hard-to-believe-in place when we die, that glassy, distant orb with its beautiful, lonely light shows could well be it.
Is this on? Yes, okay. Yes, it is awkward to hold it straight out like this, but we'll do our best. I'll start with a question that sort of glides right off the back of that passage. But first, I wanted to just say a few more compliments that are not a list of awards, although those are also very impressive. I wanted to say James Wood, writing in the New Yorker, who said about you that you're among the most consistently surprising contemporary novelists. And I think if there's anything to be consistent at, being surprising is it in art and in life. So, and it's flat out, that's true also of you. But there's also Vladimir Nabokov has a minor book called Transparent Things, and in it a character says, I'm paraphrasing, something like, there are two types of people, those who sleep and those who don't sleep. Nabokov, obviously a famous insomniac. And I mention that because one of my favorites of your books is The Shapeless Unease, which is about insomnia. And I think for this person of non-sleeping experience, it's up there with Macbeth in its level of insight and recognition. It's really quite phenomenal. But the reason I bring up your account of insomnia is that it previews the kind of psychological and cosmological and anatomical concern with time that's very much a part of this book, and that you get to in that passage. And if time is something that's distorted in Sleepless Nights, it's kind of psychedelically warped in space. It's also, I'm just thinking now that in your debut novel, The Wilderness, is also kind of a quite innovative treatment of chronology. It's about, if anyone's read it, I'm sure many have read it, it's about a man who's suffering from Alzheimer's, and it really gets into how his sense of chronology is sort of mutilated by the advancement of the disease. So all this to say that we're in the presence of an innovative philosopher of time, not just a novelist and nonfiction writer. And I wanted to just start there, and you can sort of take that prompt wherever you want. What sort of brings you back again and again to these questions of how we experience time?
Yeah, it's true that I am really preoccupied by it, and it started, it didn't start with having insomnia, although I think that gave a new sort of shape to it. And I must admit, when I was researching Orbital and I read that astronauts tend to sleep quite badly, I felt really happy about that. Yes, fellow insomniacs, even if only temporary and for a very good reason, in that they're having 16 days and nights every day. But I take great comfort from reading about other insomniacs. but my fascination with time and the way we experience it, and I guess also the way the novel can experience it and articulate it, sort of goes right back to the beginning, to the wilderness and writing about the fragmentation and sort of obliteration of chronological time through dementia. And then I think my fourth novel, The Western Wind, is sort of also really about time and about, so the novel is told backwards over 4 days, reflecting the protagonist and the narrator's desire to undo an event that has happened. And I also kind of tried to investigate the idea of the circularity of time in that book. And then I came to Orbital, and I think in some senses it's just another interrogation of time, sort of along those lines. But also I think it is very much about the upending of time, of day and night, that comes from having suffered some quite severe insomnia for quite a long time. And I think that the sort of the progress from The Shapeless Unease and a memoir about insomnia and to Orbital is sort of, and I just, the more I look at the two books, the more similar I feel like they are, and the more similar to one another they are, more so than Orbital is to my other novels, I think, in a funny way. And there's something about this sort of restlessness of the narrator, or of the narrative stance, and the different kind of registers and tones. And so I think it's not just time that I've kind of taken from The Shapeless Unease, but sort of something about the energy and the way I wanted to write sort of instinctively. And I also think in The Shapeless Unease it's very self-absorbed and very self-obsessed. It's about my suffering, my kind of pain, my insomnia. And when I finished writing that, I thought, God, I'm desperate to write about something that's not myself. And I think this book is sort of coming out the other side of that. It's sort of almost the same book, dealing with the same sorts of things, but going through the self and out to a bigger, sort of more cosmic scale. I think it seems like the inverse of The Shapeless Unease in some ways. So I don't know if that totally addresses the question of time, but there's something I'm definitely working through in my body of work. I can see and trying to figure out how the novel can deal with our experience of time and the strangeness of it, this peculiar nature of being alive and moving through time, and the way the past is this field that's ever growing behind us, and the future is a field that's sort of ever shrinking in front of us, and how we navigate that and loss and so on. It's something I think it's like the core preoccupation of my work, I think.
We'll just do this as a quick aside, but when we were in the back, it came to light that Sam normally doesn't use a smartphone, but a smartphone has been foisted upon you for the purposes of keeping track, or for the book tour, to make things a little easier. And it sounds like you're not a Candy Crush addict yet, but has the imposition of the smartphone altered your experience of time at all, or are you keeping it pretty?
It's really confused my experience of time, because today when I was in Canada it didn't work well. It didn't have any data, so it was an hour behind in front. Anyway, it was wrong. It was wrong. And my laptop was still on UK time, so I had no idea what the time was. It was actually just confused. It's just confusing. The last time it accurately had was in Chicago, so it was an hour behind. I don't know. I'm
not so smart after all.
Not so smart.
Another thing you'd mentioned in your sort of response to that question was about not only about time, but about the way you kind of handle orientation in the novel. And for such a slim novel, there really are a lot of switches in register. It'll be like the first person plural, third person, we kind of move. Sometimes we're in this collective imagination of the astronauts and cosmonauts. Tell me a little bit about the writing of that. Were you kind of tinkering? Because it all feels very seamless. It doesn't feel like obviously it doesn't feel like a kind of exercise in look what I can get away with. It feels like a way into their consciousnesses and how they're sometimes shared up there. Can you talk a little bit about the writing of those parts?
Yeah, when I first started writing Orbital, I did what I always do with novels, which is to situate the voice with one character. It's kind of my shtick, I suppose. Like, always just narrate an entire book through the point of view of one person and go deeply into their sort of inner life. And I love doing that and sort of building a character out thought by thought and feeling by feeling, cell by cell, and that's what I love to do. So that's what I started doing with this book, and it was all the first draft. In fact, I think maybe the first two drafts were completely in the point of view of one of the astronauts. So there are 4 astronauts and 2 cosmonauts in the book. And there were always those 6, but it was just narrated by one of them. And I couldn't make the book work at all. I mean, I just knew it wasn't right, and I was kind of committed to the cause of it, and I knew that I had this kind of amazing material, which is the extraordinariness of being in space, and of space being a domestic environment, and writing a realist novel about space, which is sort of surprised me that no one seemed to have done, given that we do, as humans, we have lived in space for 25 years, but no one ever writes about it, as a lived domestic space. So I knew I had something to work with, but I just couldn't make it work, and it was also set over 1 month instead of 1 day, because really the book I wanted to write was a month in the country, but in space. That's the truth of the matter. And it just, nothing was working. And I was like, how? It's remarkable that I've managed to make such captivating material so boring and flat. It's a remarkable feat. And it took me a while to realise that the 2 fundamental things about it were wrong. One was the voice was wrong. It shouldn't be in one character's point of view. And the time frame was wrong. It shouldn't be 1 month, it should be 1 day. Because I was having to sort of, there were so many breakfast times and dinner times and so many houseworking sessions, and I had to describe all the science 6 of them were doing, and over a month that was a lot. And once I realised that I could sort of encode the subject and the themes of the book into the structure by making it happen over 1 day and exploding that day into 16 orbits, and once I realised, of course, it should have a much more panoramic and elastic point of view than just being confined to one person, that I should see the book at a scale that isn't just human, and certainly isn't just one human, then the whole thing just sort of aligned and also shrank, and it became a much smaller book, and became the thing it is quite quickly, but it was such a long time to reach that somehow, even though that I know from years and years of writing that the thing that I always aim to do is to try and get that marriage of form and content right from the beginning, and yet somehow really failed with this, and it took me a long time to find how to do it.
I'm so glad you pushed through until you got there. You talked about the sort of domestic details, and one of the sort of enchanting things about the book is the sort of operational details, right? Like the forks that stick to the dining tables with magnets, and the space sickness and the way they sleep in these hanging bags, and the packets of food, and the different bathrooms for the national bathrooms. And I imagine this is the kind of book for which one could, potentially just do endless research. And I wanted to ask, not only, what kind of research did you do? Were you reading memoirs of astronauts? Were you going into anti-gravity chambers, etc.? And also, how did you know when you'd done enough research and it was time to get down to the computer and start typing or writing?
Yeah, I really love research, and it is a question of knowing when to stop, or at least when to intervene on the research and start writing. The research kind of I began with the research because I couldn't write anything without it. Once I felt I had enough to start building a world and, you know, have some plausible characters doing a few plausible things, then I began writing, because I'm always impatient just to start and see where it takes me. So I did enough research to get there, but then I researched all the way through and right up to the very end. I mean, the end, beyond the end. And I was sort of kind of taking it back from my publisher and saying, I found out a new fact, I just need to update it. And I had, I think, 9 different sort of final passes of the book, because I kept wanting to correct things or update things. So the research was simultaneous with the writing and very generative. You know, it was, I would find something out and then that would enable me to understand something more about a particular character, or it would help me to see where I wanted to go thematically, or what sort of voice I wanted to use for a particular section. So the two things were always working in tandem together. And the kind of things I was doing were kind of no anti-gravity machines, no centrifuges or anything like that, unfortunately. I didn't even speak to any astronauts, but I did read their books, and I read a lot of stuff about them, and I watched a lot of videos of them on the space station, and I spent hours and hours, hundreds of hours on the NASA website, which you can do. You can spend your whole life on the NASA website. It's a fascinating place. And first and foremost, I spent thousands of hours, I mean really thousands, just watching images of the Earth from space. So there are so many, and I don't know, I'm sure some of you will have seen them, but they're really magical and extraordinary. And you think, why aren't we all just watching this all the time? Why are any of you here now? Why aren't you watching? They really are. It's just so amazing, and really that was kind of, it was those images that made me want to write the book. It's just, well, this is giving me this kind of feeling that I can't quite contain. It's almost like feeling of being in love. You know, it's really big, expansive, sort of oxygenated feeling, and I want to try and put it into words. I want to see what I can do with those feelings that I have when I look at the Earth in space from my desk. So that was really always what I returned to, those images. And if I needed, so I'd sort of planned out my 16 orbits of this one 24-hour period, and there's the map at the beginning of the book for those who are keen, show you their orbital path for that one day. And then I think, okay, so I'm passing over Central America, and it's afternoon, and the book is set in the autumn, so I need to find some footage or a photo or something of that part of the world at that time of day, or something as close to it as possible, so that I can then describe it. So I spent so many hours just rummaging around online trying to find the images that corresponded to the things I wanted to describe.
And you could find them. That's wow, what a resource. We should all leave right now and go on the NASA website. What was sort of the easiest, the other part of the research I wanted to ask you about was, there's a lot in the book about the kind of, I think it's called a non-stick temperament, is your wonderful phrase for it, the sort of kind of demeanor that that is required of a person who's going to be plummeting at 17,000 miles an hour, I think, through space with 5 other people in a little, module. What parts of the sort of psychological experience were easiest to imagine yourself into, and which ones were sort of more difficult or required more kind of research?
I mean, so I gave up. I wrote about 5,000 words of this book, and then I right at the beginning, I gave up for a while. I mean, I thought I was giving up for good, but the reason I gave up was because I just had this sort of crisis. I thought, I can't write about this, because who cares what I have to say about space, being in space, when there are real people who have been there and are there and do write about it. Why is anyone going to want to read what I have to say? So that was the first thing. And the second thing was, although I've imagined myself into many different characters' heads before, and I believe in the imagination and the sort of the boundlessness of the imagination to kind of occupy any experience that isn't your own. I don't think I can imagine my way into an astronaut's head, because I think I'm so constitutionally unlike an astronaut. I really am the most unadventurous, sort of least brave person alive. I'm travel sick. I'm just too kind of emotional, unpractical, you know. So I thought, I can research this and I can read their books, but I can never. I'm always going to give them thoughts and feelings that are mine, and which I think that they won't really have. And I think that when I came back to the book, because I decided that I liked what I'd written, and actually I would give it a go and see what happened. But all the way through, I was sort of worried about this. You know, I think that I'm just making them like me. You know, I'm giving them too many kind of sentimental reflections. And I think that's probably true in some ways, and I decided that I would just let that be true. You know, I would just have to go with it. And I have since sort of befriended an astronaut, and we were chatting, and I said to her something like, you know, I feel really. So this is exactly the kind of thing I would say. So I feel really sad about the fact that the ISS is going to be deorbited in 2030 or whatever. It's going to like crash into the Pacific, and that's that. You know, it's got a shelf life. Everyone knows that, and besides, you know, it's really not very practical anymore for Russia and the West to be sort of trying to cooperate in this way. So it's going to be deorbited, and I said, I just feel really sad about this. It's the end of an era, and it's the end of an era of peaceful cooperation, and I fully expected her to say, having lived there, yeah, I feel really sad about that too. But she didn't. She said, oh, I don't feel sad about that at all. It's time for it to go. We're going to the moon and to Mars, you know, that's done. And I just thought, yeah, I really, I think I really probably have made them all a bit too much like me. That said, she did also say that she felt that there were lots of parts of the book where I had articulated something about the experience of being in orbit that she hadn't been able to articulate for herself. So that felt very exonerating. And she did also say there were some parts that she'd written in the margin, no! But she wouldn't tell me what they were.
Have you received feedback from other people who've been to space? It's terrifying. I mean,
yeah, I thought, I hope the word never gets out among the spacefaring community that there's this book. Unfortunately, the word got out, and I have heard from some. So there's the one British astronaut who's ever been to the ISS, Tim Peake. I did an event with him, and he's like the nicest man. He's kind of pure astronaut, just totally charming and inscrutable, and he said he liked it. Who knows? But he has asked to do another event with me. So I don't know. I feel like such a trespasser in their realm. I must say, I feel like I have no right to have written the book, and yet the science community and the space community has really taken it on. So I feel very humbled by that.
I think if you don't feel like you're transgressing a bit in your fiction, maybe you're not going far enough. So we can tell ourselves that. Also, I now you mentioned Russia. Now I can't remember if this was in the book or if it was a Google search prompted by the book, but the difference between an astronaut and a cosmonaut is it definitely comes up, and the difference is just where one is trained. Is that it? The job is the same, but a cosmonaut is of Russian or Soviet training. And okay.
Yeah, that's all. There's nothing.
Just
nothing
wanted to clarify
else.
that.
It's just,
other than you.
yeah, they didn't want to share the same word.
I wanted to also reach into my extremely marked up copy. Which 134. And there's a bit of a paragraph that, so I'm just going to read a little bit of, a slight bit of it, and then I'll ask you a question about it. So we're sort of in the collective voice of the astronauts and cosmonauts, and it's about how they are these sort of conduits, and it goes. They take blood, urine, fecal and saliva samples, monitor their heart rates and blood pressure and sleep patterns, document any ache, pain, or unusual sensation. They are data. Above all else, that a means and not an end. In its bareness, the thought brings them some relief from the anguishes of space, the loneliness of being here, and the apprehension of leaving here. It was never really about them, and it is not about them now, what they want, what they think, what they believe. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting that there are these moments in anyone's life, including the lives of these characters, where you sort of have an intense injection of historical consciousness slammed into you, right? Like this, you understand yourself to be an actor in history, and it's both ennobling and belittling, possibly at the same time. And I wanted to ask if that was something that you'd drawn from reading, from the research, or if that was something that was more of a Sam Harvey invention.
Well, it was a bit of an invention, but it sort of struck me that one of the reasons, a major reason why the ISS exists and why the astronauts and cosmonauts there are doing science all day, and being science, being the kind of the lab rats themselves and being monitored, as I say in that section, is so that we can gather data to find ways of sustaining longer duration space missions and get to the moon and be able to stay on the moon or to have a base around the moon, and to get further out and to go to Mars. So it's all about data gathering, and I was thinking, they are part of a much bigger plan. And I wonder whether, the things that I've read by astronauts, it seems that they don't really question the rightness of that plan. It's just what humans do. We just explore and we go as far as we can go because that's what we get to do. It's not about whether we should or what the end game is. It's just we get to do it. It's an opportunity. And so I kind of ventured the thought that they see themselves in that light as part of a much bigger sort of animal migration, which is our move to other planets. And in the book, there is, on the day that the book takes place, there is a moon mission that has been launched. So the book is sort of slightly in the future by a couple of years, and the moon mission is a real one that is a manned, womaned mission to the moon, which is happening. It was meant to be this year, but it's been pushed back. I'm not sure when it is now. So I wanted to kind of get into the book this sense of what's it again? Because I'm sentimental, what seems to me their kind of loyal circling of the planet, this sort of almost worshipful circling of the planet, looking at the earth, of attending to the earth, almost kind of shepherding the earth, as opposed to the new era of space travel, which is not really cooperative or collaborative. It's not about the earth, it's about getting away from the earth. It's quite commercially driven, it's quite about sort of exploiting resources. It's a land grab, really. And I wanted to try to oppose these two kind of paradigms one of which I think is really sliding into the rearview mirror, or has already slid into the rearview mirror. And that seems to me sort of part of an era of peaceful cooperation that we have lost. And I wonder how the astronauts feel about that, and that was not something I could ever ascertain from anything. It seems that they're so perfectly drilled that they can't really say anything but the sort of pathologically optimistic things about going to space. You know? So that was my sort of rationale for how they might kind of understand their place in this complex migration that we're making.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it would seem that this sort of newer imperial mindset approach towards space is incompatible with this sort of optimistic, attending scientific approach. We'll see how that pans out. I'm not totally thrilled about it. But I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll open it up to you all. It occurred to me while I was reading Orbital that and I'm sure someone has written a dissertation on this, I hope so, and I'll track it down and give them credit if so. But a great way to sort of track the health of an artistic culture is to sort of look at their examinations and speculations about outer space, whether it's, kind of speculative and futuristic, or contemporaneous, as in this one, I think about Philip K. Dick and his kind of wild-eyed, feral, doomy visions of life on Mars and sort of planets that have been turned into, insane asylums and whatnot, or the sort of touching optimism of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and on. And the tone of this book is just has an ache to it and a poignance and a melancholy that feels appropriate to sort of the end of an era. But I wondered, how deep did you go into the world of literary or televisual space exploration, and what's your sense of what that tells us about ourselves?
It's a really good question. I think it's that everything that seems to, well, maybe Star Trek is an exception, but everything that we tend to make about space and sort of in the fictional realm is usually fearful and a projection of our own fears of the unknown, I guess. And I really wanted to not do that. I mean, I think that I find the ISS really interesting in that it's in low Earth orbit, so it's kind of, I describe it in the book as Earth's backyard. It's not that far away. It's full of junk. It's sort of, and it's known to us. We have, the rest of space is kind of the last wilderness that we have, really. But low Earth orbit isn't really even a wilderness anymore. We've domesticated it, and we've kind of filled it with ourselves. So I think I just wanted to sort of look at this arena of space as something that is very known. It's almost, just kind of a retro vision of space. All of the things that were once so completely cutting edge are now looking a little bit vintage, and the space station itself is a bit rattly and vintage, and that seems really interesting to me, sort of vintage space. And I think it's really interesting that a lot of films that are being made more recently, not right now, but more recently about space have been far more like Interstellar or Arrival, or they're much more kind of contemplative and about and more philosophical, I suppose. I mean, maybe that's something that is true of sci-fi. I quite like sci-fi. I don't read it avidly, but I like it in the sense that it's a good vehicle for philosophy, and Philip K. Dick did that, with varying degrees of success, I think. But and John Wyndham I think that it's a way of kind of philosophizing about the state of the human being and our relationship to uncertainty and to the future and our relationship to our own planet. And I think it's becoming more contemplative and more complex and more interesting. I think not always, but it doesn't always have to be catastrophe based. And I really wanted with Orbital to write something that was entirely without plot, really, but also, and maybe as a result, entirely without conflict. It was so much sort of part of the project, this proposition of this book, that it would be just one day in which nothing goes wrong and in which all the people in the book are more or less happy. And what would it be to write a novel that did that? And a book that could be about beauty and about joy and sort of a suspended, rapturous floating with no conflict and to try and drive the book forward in a different way. So I think that there is more of that sort of being done in the arena of sci-fi now, and I find it quite interesting. But it is, as you say, a really kind of insightful way of looking at our relationship with the way we write about space and think about space, and it gives us good insight into who we are and where we are as a species. And I fear the way that space exploration is being used now in such a politicized way and commercialized way doesn't say great things about us. It feels like we're, to my mind, just kind of repeating all of the mistakes we've made on Earth in space.
Yes, on that bright note, turn to the audience. Yes, throw up your hand if you.
I think at the start you mentioned that in an early draft it was from one character's perspective, and then you later revised it. Can you tell us about maybe like what character that was, and whether when you revised it, did you sort of share out some of the bits you'd already written, or did you like shrink it down and rewrite new parts of it?
Yeah, so it was originally from the point of view of Nell, and did I share out? I don't think I really shared out things I'd written about her. I didn't distribute her biography among the other characters. There were probably things that she did that I shared out, but it's interesting because I do probably know more about her than I know about the other characters, but I don't really write more about her in the book, so there was a lot of her story that just kind of had to go into the wings. But it was interesting for me to not write from one character's point of view and to have this freedom to shift between all six. I've never done that before. It doesn't sound that daring, but to me it was quite daring. And also for those six to not even be the centre of the book. It's not really about them. They're part of it, what it's about, but it's not really about them. That was quite liberating once I managed to tear myself away from that one perspective. It was so much more liberating.
And that is, I'll just add that. That was such a great question, and I'll just add that sort of unlocked something for me, which is that it really does feel like a book that's less about the nouns, aka the characters, than it is about the verbs. The sort of the acts of attending to Earth and the daily practices and the maintenance. It's really interesting. Anyway, I like that. I'm going to steal that in my next talk.
Hi, my question's about Las Meninas. Why entitle it The Ladies in Waiting if the subject is ultimately about who's the most free or who's not an observer or least vain, the dog in this case?
Why entitle it Las Meninas, the Ladies in Waiting anyway? It isn't really about them. It's got the princess in the centre of the painting. It's ostensibly a portrait of the king and queen, who are only visible in the mirror.
Very meta.
Yeah, yeah. It's an amazing painting. I love it, and I started writing about it because I love it, and I just went down a rabbit hole of, as I do when I'm writing, you just get interested in things and then write about them, and then I thought, well, that doesn't have any place in this novel, so I just put it to one side. And as I got a bit deeper into the novel, I thought, actually, it's kind of what the novel is about, this upending of the idea of subject and object, and who is looking at who, and who's at the centre of the painting, who's at the periphery. It just seemed to me like a really kind of useful visual symbol of what the novel was, what I was trying to do with the novel, and when I was looking at it, and you can see these online, you can see these kind of pictures of the painting, and then people have numbered all of the different characters in the painting and said who they are and what they're doing in it. And nobody ever mentioned the dog. I mean, the dog was never given a number or never talked about, and yet there it is at the front of the painting, sort of this majestic, beautiful creature with its eyes closed, and that just seemed fascinating to me, and I don't suppose the dog is there by chance. So it just deepened the riddle of the painting for me, and it seemed to be some kind of articulation of what the book was about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Molly, first of all, I love your Substack.
I should start writing on it again.
I love that. Samantha, I'm also a huge fan. I'm very fascinated by the concept of legacy, and I guess I'm wondering, as you go from book to book, is there anything you want to leave behind in your writing? I know that's a strange question, but is that something you've given any thought to?
When you say leave behind, what do you mean? Like,
I don't know, when people look at your collection of work in 50, 100 years from now, like, is there something that you intend on leaving behind with that?
okay. Gosh, that's a really good and difficult question to answer. I mean, I think I kind of have to say, well, not necessarily no, but I don't know. I just don't know. I think that it's going to sound like a really evasive answer, but I think that writing for me is such a kind of emotional project. More and more as I go through my career, I think it's becoming less an intellectual thing, more an emotional thing, and it's about me just trying, with the only medium I really have, to express sort of the enormity of experience as I sometimes feel it, and it doesn't always feel enormous, but where the sort of things that seem to really matter to me, or things I really want to think about or explore, and I try to write from my heart predominantly, and to write from a feeling. So I usually start with a feeling, and whenever I get lost with my writing, or I kind of forget what it is I'm doing, just kind of sidetracked, I come back to that feeling and just think, right, I'll come back to this, and I'll write from this, and I'll see where I go, and it will lead me in the right direction. And I think because of that, it's hard to say what I want the reader to take from it, because what I hope is that whatever comes from my heart might sort of land somewhere in the reader's heart in whatever way it does for that person, and that's going to be completely different for each person. So maybe the legacy is sort of an emotional one, just one of the picking up of a feeling, as with a piece of music, I suppose. I think I'm a frustrated musician, really. The way a piece of music can just instantly make you feel something, and that's its legacy, and that could change from day to day. But it's a sort of transmission of a feeling. I think that's what I want for my work.
Yeah, we have time for like 2 more.
We have time for 2 more.
Yeah, no, you're. Here you are.
Hi. Oh,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yes, it is okay.
Hi.
Molly, I feel like we clipped that too. Samantha, this is for you. Do you write by hand or by typing? And I know there's probably not a reason, but if you have a reason why, perhaps?
I can't write longhand. I mean, I can barely write. I mean, I can't read my own handwriting, so if I wrote longhand, I wouldn't know what it said afterwards. There's something about the typing, I think, that has a sort of a very, it's probably the same for most people, you know, it's a very efficient feedback loop. With longhand, I just can't achieve it, and I'd like to, because it's really convenient. You can just write wherever you are, and that seems very kind of romantic and what writers should do, but I just really can't do it. And I think for that matter, I'm not someone who tends to just write in little sort of fitful bursts of inspiration. I have to sit down in a fairly, disciplined way for a few hours and work at a desk, preferably with no view and nothing interesting happening, and just see it as work. And it's only when I do that something that might feel anything like inspiration comes. So it's, yeah, I really just can't. I've tried many times to write longhand, but I just can't.
Nice question, and then we'll do 2 more actually, because
Hi. Samantha, thank you so much. This was a fabulous book to read. I think the question I had, and you mentioned this kind of earlier about the sort of relationship between magic and science, and this kind of comes through, and like at what, when you kind of talk to scientists, there's a bit of a, there's no objectivity. There's a bit of, when they do their experimentation, when they do things, it's almost like you're not really considering the magic of the science that's happening there. So in some of your research, and as you were doing this, were there times when you had to kind of toe the line between the two, or were you fully pulled into the magic of space? Because one of the things that I immediately thought of yesterday when the SpaceX crew was retrieved was your book, because to me that was just magical. Like when they landed on water, I got goosebumps, right? And that to me was a magical kind of response, and I know there's so much science to it, but at some point you have to kind of toe the line and be like, no, I have to also do justice to the science.
Yeah, it was magical, and that splashdown and the dolphins swimming around them was quite incredible. I think it's because I'm not a scientist, and I'm not kind of scientifically minded, and I struggle with anything but surface level science. I think that it's 1 part science and 9 parts magic for me always, and I tend to see the sort of the wonder. When I was researching the book, people sometimes say to me, was there anything that surprised you when you were researching the book? Everything. I mean, every single thing. So even just the fact that they're floating on the ISS because they're free falling, not because there's no gravity, because there's plenty of gravity, but because they're in this constant state of free fall, and the ISS is kind of free falling around the Earth, and the Earth is falling away from the spacecraft at the same time, and the Earth is falling through space. I mean, this to me is kind of extraordinary, and I think most scientists would feel that too. I don't think knowing facts and understanding facts kind of detracts from that. I think most scientists would kind of feel that it just adds to the extraordinary magic of it to know how it works. So I think that it was always, for me, about that, and it was more a question of trying to stay factual and not get carried away with my own sort of artistic reveries on things, to try and keep bringing the facts in, but trying to alchemize them, I guess, into fiction and to bring them into this realm of spellbinding, which I think is what science sometimes struggles to do, you know. And I'm interested in anything that sort of sits at the junction of the arts and sciences, because they are kind of speaking the same language. There is this base wonder to everything, and that's really what I was trying to get at in the book.
We have time for one more question. Where do you pick?
No, you can go ahead and ask, I can ask her later.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you. Here, who is? Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Hello? Is this thing on?
Yeah,
I
project.
think it's not on.
You have to
I think
project.
It's not on.
It's
You have
on.
to
I have to
press the
project.
There you
button
go.
so
There you
that
go.
it's
Requisite Molly Young Substack. Get that out of the way. You mentioned like a suspended joy, and I just wanted to mention that I felt that the act of reading this book was very physical, and that it was effective in that way, that it felt like a dose of dopamine. It felt like therapeutic. And I was just realizing that actually now when I approach the book and I open it, it's like I'm anticipating like a hit. That makes it sound bad, but I mean that all in a good way. It wasn't addictive, but in a good way. It felt like relief because it was so joyful, and it was like marinating in beauty that we don't get to do that often these days. Like you mentioned, no conflict. And I had written down in the book, how did she feel while writing this? And I was curious, after you closed your laptop, how did you feel?
Well, I think that he's saying that it's like a hit of dopamine is the highest praise. I'll take that. I really loved writing this book. I mean, obviously how I felt varied from day to day and week to week, and there were days when I'm sure, as always with writing a book, it was just frustrating and thankless and difficult, and I was lost in it. But I think on the whole I felt, because of this sort of project of trying to write from this feeling that I had, which was very expansive, and coming back every day to that feeling and thinking, if I'm not writing from that feeling, then what I'm writing isn't going to stay. I have to use that material in another way. It's not working. I think that it felt mentally consoling to me to write it, and I was writing a lot of it. I started it before lockdown, but I was writing quite a lot of it during lockdown. So in that sense, it was a very liberating book to write during lockdown, because I was just looking at images from low Earth orbit every day, and that felt like great escapism. And it was also very good to write during lockdown because, you know, I was like everyone else, sort of trapped in my house, and the characters in the book are trapped and they can't sort of see their loved ones and so on. So it felt like a very apt lockdown book. But I felt that I think maybe of all of my books, people often say, when you finished a book, do you feel bereft, or do you feel sad? And I always think, oh God, no, I'm delighted that it's done. But with this one, I did feel I didn't want to let it go. I did, and I think there was much more there that I wanted to say. And in some ways that's carried over into the book that I'm writing now, which I see sort of is kind of born of the same kind of feeling in some ways. So it felt really expansive and fun, and consoling for the most part. And I found I could sort of get that short distance from the earth from my desk. And I could zoom out just far enough to not feel quite so upset and angry about everything all the time, and to feel it's not that looking at it from a distance makes all the problems go away or makes you naive about them, but it's that you can hold all of the contradictory feelings at once. So the despair and the sort of sadness and the anger and the joy and the beauty and the rapture. You can sort of hold them all in view at once, and I found that really really consoling.
Yay, thank you both so much for If you don't have your hardcover with you, we have paperback versions of Orbital, as well as some other works, and be sure to subscribe to the Substack that I'm like now find. You better update it. And we're going to be doing a signing sort of around that corner towards the matrix, the poetry matrix right now. So bear with us while we move some stuff around and rearrange stuff. Now's a good time to get a drink and come back up and then line up for the signing. Thank you all so much for coming.